The years following the usurpation of a royal dynasty, before the new succession line has a chance to stabilize itself, is an incredibly perilous period for the realm subjected to it. Perhaps the single most dangerous time is when the new lineage's founding figure, its great conqueror or unifying genius who pushed himself to the forefront of history, dies, leaving behind successors incapable of inheriting the heavy mantle of rule. Fantasy's most iconic example of the potentially cataclysmic outcome of such upheavals is Game of Thrones' War of the Five Kings. Join us here at Wizards and Warriors as we tell the epic tale of how the Seven Kingdoms descended into civil war, resulting in the fall of ancient houses, the transformation of Westeros into a mass killing field, and the background for the mythical White Walkers to make their devastating return. It's almost as chaotic as the war between the 13 civilizations of our sponsor, Rise of Kingdoms, a free cross-platform strategy game now released on PC, in which you collect resources, train troops, advance technology, battle your rivals, and build your dream city. They've just added a new civilization, Egypt. You can take their historic heroes like Cleopatra into real-time battles with Egyptian-style units like powerful bowmen. See how they face up against tons of other historic armies and societies. You also build your city with Egyptian and Greco-Roman style buildings, including pyramids of course, and you can explore a world of 1.44 million square kilometers, filled with mysterious encounters and beautiful sights. And don't do it all alone, you can join or create alliances to work together with other players, from farming to defense to strategy to ruling the world. Fight right now in the Battle of Egypt League for a limited time only and make a name for yourself. You can get the game on PC or mobile, and if you download it using our link in the description and use our code, you'll get a load of free gifts. There's also an in-game contest right now to win a round-trip ticket to Egypt, so go give it a shot. When Aerys Targaryen II ascended Westeros' Iron Throne in the 262nd year after Aegon's conquest, he, with the aid of the astute Tywin Lannister, ushered in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. However, the course of his 21-year reign gradually warped Aerys into a violent, paranoid despot. The excesses of the Mad King, as he became known, turned Tywin against him, and eventually triggered Robert's Rebellion in 282 AC. Also known as the War of the Usurper to Targaryen loyalists, this epochal year-long conflict shattered the dynasty of the Dragon Kings and sent its survivors into exile. Robert Baratheon seized the throne at King's Landing, beginning a new age for Westeros. But Robert proved a far worse king than he had been a soldier. Under his rule, the throwing of myriad feasts, tourneys, and other spectacles bankrupted the Seven Kingdoms. Not only that, but the new monarch also proved critically unable to control his new wife, Cersei Lannister, daughter of the wealthy and powerful Tywin. Throughout the subsequent decade and a half of Baratheon rule, Robert and Cersei sired 3 children named Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. Unfortunately, all was not as it seemed. Various notables in the capital, including Robert's Hand of the King, Jon Arryn, and his dour brother Stannis, grew suspicious about the true lineage of these royal scions. The 2 prominent nobles conducted an investigation into the matter, eventually coming to the conclusion that the king's children were in truth the result of an incestuous relationship between Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime, a member of the Kingsguard. Before this cabal could bring its findings to Robert, however, Jon Arryn died suddenly, secretly poisoned by his own wife Lisa Tully at the behest of the schemer Peter Baelish, Littlefinger. Anxious, and believing Jon Arryn's death had been a murder prompted by the groundbreaking findings about Robert's children, Stannis Baratheon withdrew to his island citadel of Dragonstone, and began quietly raising forces. In the meantime, Robert, who required a new Hand of the King, marched north with his royal entourage in 298 AC to request that his greatest friend, Eddard Stark, take up the position. The Warden of the North at Winterfell intended to refuse, but a single letter changed all that. Prompted by the plotter behind the curtain, Littlefinger, Lisa Tully sent a secret message to her sister Catelyn, Stark's wife, falsely implicating the Lannisters in Jon Arryn's death to foment conflict. This revelation obliged Eddard to take up the position of Hand in order to further investigate the matter and the culpability of the Lannisters, with whom the Starks already had enmity. Underlying tensions only increased further when, during the royal court's final days at Winterfell, Eddard's son Bran witnessed the Queen and Jaime during an intimate moment. Jaime threw the boy from the window to silence him, and although there were no other witnesses and the boy was in a coma, suspicion still fell on the Lannisters. The royal court, with Lord Stark in tow, departed south along the King's Road not long after. Once they'd departed, a mysterious assassin, wielding a Valyrian steel dagger, attempted to murder Bran in his bed, but failed in the task. Intent on revealing the truth of things for herself, Catelyn made for King's Landing via a different route, and without the burden of a large caravan, arrived there before her husband. There, Littlefinger's manipulations concerning the ornate dagger led both Starks to believe that their son's murder had been orchestrated by Tyrion Lannister, the notorious Imp. Having told Lord Stark what he needed to hear, Catelyn departed north, and Eddard began his tenure as King Robert's right-hand man. But fate had it that as Catelyn returned north, she encountered Tyrion Lannister coming south from the Wall. Buoyed by Lord Baelish's previous lies concerning the Imp and existing bad blood, Catelyn roused Rivermen soldiers within a local inn to take Tyrion captive. With him and a makeshift retinue accompanying her, Catelyn moved east towards the Eyrie, her sister's mountaintop citadel. However, word of this quickly reached the Lannister stronghold of Casterly Rock. Tywin, ever unwilling to allow his house to be humiliated with impunity, responded with war. The ruthless Western Lord began rallying bannermen and vassals, but wasn't about to let that time go to waste. While tens of thousands of troops mustered at Casterly Rock, Tywin dispatched the infamous knight Sir Gregor Clegane to the Riverlands with a small vanguard force. Disguised as a common raider, this giant brute and his band plundered throughout Catelyn's ancestral homeland. Not only would this maneuver prevent the Riverlords, who were allied to the Starks via the marriage between Eddard and Catelyn, from mustering their forces to resist the main Lannister thrust, but Tywin also calculated that it would also draw the Honourable Lord Stark into the conflict personally, where he could be captured. Events elsewhere quickly put a stop to that tidy strategy. For when news of Tyrion's imprisonment reached King's Landing, Jaime accosted Lord Stark in the streets. In the skirmish that ensued, Eddard's bannermen were killed and the King's Hand himself wounded, rendering him unable to ride west. Jaime fled to join his father, while Lord Stark dispatched Lord Beric Dondarrion with 100 riders to arrest Clegane. As his high nobles began turning on one another, risking an outbreak of violence in the realm, King Robert was off hunting in the Kingswood. At about this time, Stark finally confronted the Queen with his findings concerning her children, doing so in an attempt to spare their lives from Robert's inevitable wrath. However, Robert had been gored by a boar during his hunt, suffering mortal wounds and laying at death's door in the Red Keep. Shortly thereafter, Eddard was named Protector of the Realm until the heir, Joffrey, came of age. Sensing the need to secure the succession, and realizing the potential danger Cersei and her faction posed, Renly Baratheon, the king's youngest brother, offered to aid Stark in taking the Lannister Baratheon royals hostage. Eddard declined him, once again citing honor as his reason. With little other choice, Renly fled the capital to join his Tyrell allies at Highgarden and prepare for the looming war that he suspected might be on the horizon. Matters came to a climax when King Robert Baratheon died, and Cersei proclaimed Joffrey monarch of the Seven Kingdoms, in defiance of her late husband's wishes. Lord Stark attempted to intervene, but was betrayed by Littlefinger and the City Watch. The remainder of his retinue died on the throne room floor, while the Warden of the North himself was thrown into jail. The Lannister faction took King's Landing and sent a message to Winterfell demanding Stark's submission. Rather than kneel to the false king, Eddard's oldest son, Robb, the young wolf, instead raised his father's banners and mustered an army of close to 20,000 Northmen on his way to the south. At the same time, two Lannister armies launched an invasion of the Riverlands. One, under the command of Jaime Lannister, 15,000 strong, destroyed the Riverlords in pitched battles at the Golden Tooth and Riverrun before putting the Tully Castle to siege. It was at this time that Tyrion was able to join his father after surviving a trial due to the fighting skills of his champion Bronn. Meanwhile, Gregor Clegane's vanguard force defeated Dondarrion at the Mummer's Ford. The shattered remnants of Dondarrion's group escaped and continued the war as bitter guerrilla fighters, and would eventually form the Brotherhood without banners. Meanwhile, Tywin's main host crossed into the Riverlands via a more southerly route, following Clegane's triumph, and began methodically conquering lesser nobles in the area adjacent to the Trident. With that lightning attack, the initial stage of the war effectively ended, the Tully vassals smashed, scattered, or bottled up in their castles by Tywin's blitzkrieg. Their fate now depended on the actions of the Starks. Convinced that the Lannister overlord possessed too much strategic acumen to risk invading the north, Robb Stark conferred with his lords and came up with an offensive plan to take the war to Tywin. With hopes of rescuing the imprisoned Lord Eddard lifting the spirits of its men, the northern host then began marching south along the King's Road. After a long march, the Stark army arrived at the Twins, the only real crossing of the Trident River's Green Fork. For Robb's military machinations to succeed, he needed to cross that river. With scouting reports coming in outlining Riverrun's increasingly grim situation, Robb hurriedly, albeit reluctantly, made a deal with House Frey, promising to marry one of Walder Frey's daughters. By nightfall, he and his army's passage was secured, and 4,000 Frey men-at-arms joined the Stark cause. While almost all of his archers, pikes, and men-at-arms remained on the eastern bank, under the command of the cunning Lord Roose Bolton, Robb led his mounted contingent across the Green Fork and south towards Riverrun. Commander of the Lannister Scouts, Sir Adam Marbrand, failed to realise that the Starks crossed the river, which allowed them to march undetected through the night and arrive a mile north of Tywin's camp near the Crossroads Inn by daybreak. Despite being taken by surprise, organisation and discipline allowed the Lannister army to muster for battle in short order, and march to meet the Starks on the King's Road, adjacent to the Green Fork. Tywin's cousin Sir Kevan commanded 10,000 men in the centre. 3 lines of archers, interspersed by pike blocks, made up the front line, and behind them, rank upon rank of soldiers armed with assorted melee weapons. Dead centre was Kevan himself, at the head of 300 heavy cavalry. A steel hammer of 4,000 knightly cavalry under Marbrand manned the right wing. Tywin purposely massed his army's undisciplined refuse on the left wing, a motley assembly of Gregor's warband, mounted archers, Vale tribesmen allies, mercenaries, and untested conscripts of all sorts. Tywin himself, clad in ornate Lannister garb, headed the reserve of 2,500 footmen and an equal number of horse. This 20,000-strong army of the West outnumbered its northern counterpart by roughly 3,000 troops. Its commander, Roose Bolton, although the Lannisters believed Robb was present, led an army of 16,500 warriors from the cold north, together with their Frey allies. Present were houses Glover, Hornwood, Karstark, Umber, and others. Most of the Stark cavalry was away with their great lord to the west, but Bolton still had around 600 with which to work. The deep, thrumming din of war horns resounded from the northern side of the battlefield as Stark bannermen charged at a run. They were met not only by the impetuous blare of Lannister trumpets, but hail after hail of arrows from Kevan's bowmen. Hundreds of advancing northerners fell to this volley, but they came on anyway. On the riverine flank, Gregor's mounted wing of renegades and malcontents galloped into the fray. Contrary to Tywin's plan of baiting the northern right flank into a trap by crushing his undisciplined left, Gregor's brute force and combat experience instead smashed the crescent-shaped Stark shield wall opposing him. Vale tribesmen and other riders flooded through the gap, tearing a wound into the northern right flank. Immediately pivoting his strategy, Tywin maneuvered his 5,000 reserve troops towards the river, in the hope of capitalizing on his advantage there. Meanwhile, Lord Kevan's archers continued unleashing missile fire into the Stark troops behind the shield walls. At the same time, he ordered pike blocks to advance against the beleaguered enemy infantry in an orderly fashion. They did so with aplomb, pushing the Northern army back against the hills north of the battlefield. Details are not forthcoming about what Marbrand's wing accomplished, but it is likely the knightly horsemen also attempted to outflank and crush the 600 Stark cavalry present. The battle was already over when Tywin's 5,000 moved to reinforce Gregor and mop up the last northern resistance, shattering their lines like glass beneath the hammer of their charge. Roose Bolton lost several thousand men in the battle and the retreat that followed. However, the Lord of the Dreadfort managed to withdraw north with about 12,000 fresh and unharmed soldiers, his army intact. But his task had never been to win an outright victory. After interrogating his captives, Tywin finally discovered that Robb Stark had not been present at the Green Fork. Instead, to the west, in the damp forests north of Riverrun, Robb Stark and his cavalry were about to make their debut on the battlefield, a display of tactical and strategic brilliance. En route to the Tully capital, the Stark heir managed to absorb thousands of Riverlander soldiers from Seaguard and the scattered remnants of Edmund Tully's forces defeated at Riverrun. Thanks to the exhaustive efforts of the Blackfish Brynden Tully and his elite Outrider vanguard, who tirelessly shot Lannister communication ravens out of the sky and killed enemy scouts, the 15,000 besiegers of Riverrun, encamped in 3 camps divided by rivers, remained blissfully unaware of Robb and perhaps 6,000 men under his command lurking nearby. The detailed scouting efforts told Robb that Jaime Lannister, always a dynamic albeit impatient military commander, routinely launched expeditions to hunt for small Tully-harrying contingents raiding Lannister supply lines, or to seize smaller recalcitrant castles in the area. Utilizing the knowledge of Jaime's routine sorties from the siege works, the Stark army developed a plan to lure the enemy commander into a cunning trap. Robb concealed the greater part of his mounted corps in a forested valley midway between Riverrun and Oldstones, known as the Whispering Wood. The cavalry of House Stark's cadet branch of Karstark took up position in the gorge's narrower northern reaches. Mallister, Umber and Mormont forces deployed on the eastern edge of the valley, while Robb, his personal Stark retinue, and the Frey horsemen arrayed themselves to the west. Once in place, this reverse V-shaped formation lay silently in wait, shrouded by dense valley foliage. Simultaneously, the Blackfish and a few hundred riders carrying Tully banners assailed Lannister posts and supply caravans near Riverrun. The emergence of yet another guerrilla threat provoked Jaime into launching a further, apparently routine sortie against what he believed to be mere dozens of raiders. After mustering between 1,500 and 2,500 Lannister cavalry, Jaime took the bait and pursued the Blackfish north, straight into the jaws of Robb's trap. Brynden's force charged at a gallop into the Whispering Wood right as Jaime's knights seemed primed to catch them. Then, as the last of the Lannister riders crossed the threshold of the valley, it is said that above the thundering hoofbeats resounded the quaint call of native snowshrikes. However, this indistinct call might equally have served as a predetermined signal by Stark forces to enact the ambush. As the moon shone its pale light down from above, barely able to penetrate the dense canopy, the deep boom of northern war horns reverberated from the north, west, and east, signaling the unified attack. The 6,000 Stark and Riverlandish cavalry charged, descending on Jaime's detachment from 3 sides. Blackfish and his unit turned and launched their own attack. The nighttime cavalry engagement was a brutal, confusing affair. However, the better prepared and numerically superior Stark forces quickly gained the advantage. Realizing his imminent defeat, Jaime Lannister gathered a picked force of elite lords and knights to him. Then, hoping to kill the Stark leader, he desperately charged up the valley directly at Robb Stark's contingent. A brilliant warrior and swordsman, Jaime managed to cut his way through, personally slaying 3 of Robb's bodyguards before being subdued. Still, despite that last gasp, Lannister forces had been utterly crushed, all of their men killed or captured, together with 100 knights and a dozen lords. In one fell swoop, the Lannister army putting Riverrun to siege had been deprived of the majority of its command echelons. However, the army as a military force still remained a powerful, albeit dangerously divided force, numbering perhaps 12,000 or so men, divided between 3 siege camps. This scattered disposition proved necessary due to the Tully Citadel's natural strength of defence, flanked as it was by the confluence of the Tumblestone and Red Fork to the east and north, and by an artificially deepened moat to the west. After his triumph at the Whispering Wood, Robb marched his force at speed and swiftly moved on Riverrun under the cover of darkness. His aim was to exploit the advantage by relieving his mother's homeland and take one half of Casterly Rock's martial strength out of the war. As the young wolf's army circled its prey and prepared to strike, the prey in question was totally unaware that anything was amiss. The Blackfish descended on the northern camp with Robb's vanguard, quickly routing any semblance of resistance from the bedazzled defenders and clearing palisades. Reinforcements then launched the main assault, and it became clear that the camp would be overrun. Screams of death, the clang of weapons, and burning tents started to rouse the other 2 camps. Seeking to aid his comrades, Lord Andros Brax in the western camp raised and rallied a detachment and began ferrying it across the Tumblestone on rafts. Unfortunately for these prospective reinforcements, Tully catapults, in an attempt to aid their rescuers, began raining down great boulders onto the crossing contingent, smashing rafts to splinters and overturning a great many others. Lord Brax himself, together with hundreds of soldiers, drowned in the roiling Tumblestone. The scarce few Lannister warriors that did manage to make landfall found Stark bannermen waiting for them and were cut down where they stood. As this disaster unfolded on the northern flank of the battlefield, Robb Stark himself, his direwolf Greywind at his side, led 2 divisions of armoured riders in an assault on the western camp. Alerted by the Blackfish's initial attack, spearmen in the western camp managed to form a shield wall and beat away the first charge. However, upon noticing the engagement, Tully holdouts under Lord Titus Blackwood lowered the drawbridge of Riverrun and sallied forth, attacking the Lannister forces from behind. Prisoners captured in Jaime's initial victories were released, and the besieging army's siege weapons put to the torch. Realizing defeat was now inevitable, commander of the eastern camp, Forley Prester, opted not to throw his own troops into the grinder also. Instead, he mustered 2,000 spearmen together with 2,000 archers and retreated from Riverrun in good order. A mercenary captain from Tirosh did not reach the same conclusion, and rather than go with Prester, lowered his banners and defected to the victorious northern side. Jaime had been captured, the siege of Riverrun broken, and an entire Lannister army destroyed. The young wolf had introduced Westeros to his military prowess in a stunning display, but the Starks were about to suffer a loss that would change not only the face of the war, but the continent as a whole. The conflict that would later be called the War of Five Kings was just starting, and we will cover it all. We're planning to cover the battles of all major fantasy, sci-fi and alternative history worlds, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing. This goes a long way to help us in the eyes of the almighty algorithm. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to see what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. Your feedback is very important to us. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.